Hey y'all, my name is Jordan Mitchell. I'm 33 years old, and I live in Austin, Texas. You know, the city with the slogan, Keep Austin Weird. For most of my life, I thought that slogan was made for me. Turns out, I wasn't just Austin weird. I was autistic weird, with a side of ADHD, and it took me 31 years to figure that out. I'm telling you this story because maybe you're like me. Maybe you've spent your whole life feeling like you're wearing a costume that almost fits, but never quite right. Maybe you've been successful on paper but exhausted in real life. Maybe you've lived in a city that celebrates being different, but you still felt too different, even for the weirdos. Let me take you back to East Austin in the 1990s, before the food trucks and tech bros, when it was still mostly Mexican families and weird artists who couldn't afford anywhere else. My family lived in a little house on Cesar Chavez Street, and my mom used to say, "Jordan, you're gonna love it here. Austin loves people who are different." She was right about Austin loving different people. She just didn't know how different I actually was. I was the kid who could take apart a computer at age 8 but couldn't handle the cafeteria at lunch. While other kids in my elementary school were trading Pokemon cards, I was obsessing over this old Commodore 64 my dad brought home from a garage sale. I would spend hours, and I mean hours, just typing code from programming books, not even understanding what half of it did, but totally mesmerized by the patterns. My teachers called it exceptional focus. My parents called it Jordan being Jordan. What none of us knew was that this was my first special interest, and that hyperfocus would become both my superpower and my kryptonite for the next 2 decades. The first time I remember feeling really, truly different was during South by Southwest when I was 9 years old. Now, if you don't know SXSW, imagine if someone took every sound in the world, cranked it up to 11, added flashing lights, crowds of drunk people, and the smell of barbecue smoke mixed with porta-potty chemicals, then spread that across your entire city for 2 weeks. For most Austinites, it's Christmas morning. For me, it was sensory hell. I remember my parents taking me downtown to see some band that was supposed to be the next big thing. The music was so loud I could feel it in my chest, like my heartbeat was trying to sync up with the bass drum. The crowd was pushing and moving like some kind of living organism, and I was trapped in the middle of it. I started crying, not sad crying, but that overwhelmed, overstimulated crying that comes from somewhere deep in your nervous system. "He's just tired," my mom explained to concerned strangers. Too much excitement, but I wasn't tired. My brain was on fire. Every sound, every smell, every brush of a stranger's jacket against my arm was like getting shocked with electricity. I couldn't explain it then, but I was having what I now know was a meltdown. In the middle of Austin's biggest celebration of weirdness, I was too weird even for the weird people. This became a pattern. Every March, SXSW would roll around, and my family would get excited about all the cool stuff happening in our city. And every March, I would find reasons to stay home, or if I had to go out, I'd end up overwhelmed and miserable. My parents started calling me their little hermit. "Jordan's just not a people person," they'd say. And I believed them. I thought I was antisocial, maybe a little broken. I didn't know that my brain was processing every single input at maximum volume, while everyone else had natural filters. School was its own special challenge. Austin ISD had these programs for gifted kids, and I tested into them easily. Academically, I was crushing it. Socially, well, let's just say I was that kid who corrected the teacher's math and got genuinely confused when everyone groaned. I didn't understand why accuracy was annoying. I developed what I now know were coping mechanisms, but back then, I just thought of them as my little quirks. I had to sit in the same seat in every classroom, not because I was controlling, but because change made my skin feel itchy from the inside. I ate the same lunch every day, peanut butter and jelly, cut diagonally with the crusts removed, because new foods felt like taking a gamble with my entire day's comfort. And the stimming. Oh man, the stimming. I was a chronic pen clicker, leg bouncer, paper ripper. My teachers were constantly telling me to sit still and stop fidgeting. I learned to do it smaller, quieter, less noticeable. I was masking before I even knew what masking was. The weird thing about growing up in Austin is that being smart and obsessed with computers actually made me cool in some circles. This was the 90s, right when the tech boom was starting to hit Austin. Dell Computer was headquartered here, IBM had a huge presence, and suddenly being a computer nerd wasn't just acceptable, it was valuable. But even in the nerd community, I felt like I was playing a character. I could talk about processors and RAM and programming languages for hours, but ask me about anything else, sports, music, what I did for fun, and I'd just freeze. I learned to deflect with humor or redirect conversations back to computers. I became really good at asking other people questions about themselves, so I didn't have to reveal how empty my social toolkit really was. By the time I hit middle school, I had developed what felt like a sophisticated social strategy. I watched other kids like I was studying a foreign language. I noted which jokes got laughs, which topics kept conversations going, which facial expressions were appropriate in which situations. I created what I now realize was a detailed mental database of normal human behavior. It was exhausting. If you're listening to this and thinking, "Holy crap, that sounds exactly like my childhood," you're not alone. The thing about being autistic in a city that celebrates weirdness is that you can hide in plain sight for years. Everyone just assumes you're eccentric, artistic, or brilliantly quirky. But somewhere deep down, you know there's something more going on. Something that no amount of keeping it weird is going to fix. Stick with me. This story gets a lot more complicated before it gets better. Looking back now, I can see all the signs that were right there in front of everyone. The meltdowns disguised as sensitivity. The special interests labeled as giftedness. The stimming called hyperactivity. The masking mistaken for shyness or maturity. But in the 90s, especially in Texas, especially for a kid who was doing well in school, no one was looking for autism. And definitely not level 2 autism in a kid who could code and got good grades. I was learning to be a professional weird person in a city full of amateur weird people. I just didn't know the difference yet. By the time I started high school, I had my mask pretty well figured out. I was the smart computer kid who was a little awkward but basically harmless. I had a handful of friends who were also into tech, and I could maintain that identity as long as I stuck to familiar environments and predictable social scripts. But high school in Austin meant more than just academics. It meant football games with screaming crowds, pep rallies in gymnasiums with terrible acoustics, school dances where the social rules changed every song. It meant navigating the complex teenage social hierarchy, while my brain was already working overtime just to process basic daily life. And then there was the ADHD component that nobody, including me, fully understood yet. I could hyper-focus on programming for 8 hours straight, but couldn't remember to turn in a simple homework assignment. I could memorize every specification of the latest computer processors, but would forget my locker combination 3 times a week. My brain felt like a Ferrari with bicycle brakes, incredibly powerful, but impossible to control. My parents took me to our family doctor when my grades started slipping despite my obvious intelligence. "Classic ADHD," he said after a 15-minute conversation. "Let's try some medication." And you know what? The medication helped. Kind of. It made me more focused during school hours, better at completing assignments, less likely to lose my backpack. But it didn't touch the sensory issues, the social confusion, the meltdowns, or the crushing exhaustion I felt every day from pretending to be someone I wasn't. "See?" everyone said. "Jordan just needed a little help with focus. He's fine now." But I wasn't fine. I was just medicated enough to mask more effectively. The medication became another tool in my masking arsenal. It helped me sit still in class, finish homework, look like I was paying attention during boring lectures. But it also made me feel like I was watching my life through a window. Present, but not quite there. Functional, but not quite authentic. And every March, when SXSW rolled around and my entire city transformed into sensory chaos, I was reminded that no amount of medication was going to make me neurotypical. I would spend those 2 weeks essentially hibernating, telling friends I was too busy with schoolwork to hang out, avoiding downtown entirely, counting the days until my city went back to normal. "Jordan's just not into the party scene," people would say. And I'd nod along, grateful for the explanation that didn't require me to say, "Actually, your city's biggest cultural celebration makes me want to crawl into a sensory deprivation tank for 2 weeks." By senior year, I had it all figured out. I was going to UT for computer science, I'd found my people in the tech community, and I had a plan. Austin was becoming the Silicon Hills. The perfect place for someone like me to build a career hiding behind code and screens. I thought I had cracked the code of being human. I had no idea I was just getting started. Fall 2008. I'm walking across the UT campus for the first time as an official computer science major, carrying a backpack that weighs about 40 pounds, because I can't figure out which textbooks I actually need and which ones are just recommended. So I brought all of them, just in case. University of Texas at Austin was perfect for me in theory. Huge campus where you could disappear into crowds, world-class computer science program, and right in the heart of a city that already knew me. I figured college would be like high school, but with more freedom and less forced social interaction. I was so wrong. The first thing that hit me was the sheer sensory overload of campus life. UT has like 50,000 students, and during class changes, the main walkways become these rivers of people all talking, laughing, playing music, shouting to friends across the way. The construction noise, because there's always construction at UT, mixed with traffic from Guadalupe Street, mixed with the constant hum of air conditioning units working overtime in Texas heat. I learned real quick that walking from the computer lab in the engineering building to my dorm in Jester was like running a daily gauntlet. I started mapping out alternate routes that took twice as long but avoided the worst choke points. I became an expert in the tunnel system under campus, even though it was technically for facilities management. My roommate was this kid from Dallas named Marcus, who seemed to have been born knowing how to college. Day one, he's already made friends with half our floor, figured out the best dining halls, and somehow got invited to 3 different parties. Meanwhile, I'm sitting in our tiny dorm room, setting up my computer and wondering how he made all this look so easy. "Dude, you should come out with us tonight," Marcus would say. "There's this sick party in West Campus." And I'd always have an excuse. Too much homework. Not feeling well. Had to call my parents. The truth was, the idea of going to a party, loud music, crowds of strangers, no clear social script, alcohol making everyone's behavior even more unpredictable, sounded like volunteering for torture. But here's the thing about UT and Austin in general. There are so many different tribes and subcultures that you can almost always find your people. I found mine in the computer labs. While other freshmen were out discovering 6th Street and football tailgates, I was discovering the joy of having 24-hour access to some of the best computer facilities in the country. The CS building became my sanctuary. Late at night, when most of campus was either partying or sleeping, the labs would be mostly empty except for a handful of other students as obsessed with code as I was. These were my people, kids who could debug C++ for 6 hours straight, who got genuinely excited about algorithm optimization, who understood that sometimes you just need to work on a problem until 4 a.m. because that's when the solution finally clicks. I started spending more time in the labs than in my dorm. Marcus barely saw me except when I'd stumble back to shower and grab clean clothes. "Man, you're like a vampire," he'd joke. But hey, whatever works. What worked was structure. I created elaborate routines for myself that let me navigate university life without too much chaos. Same route to classes every day. Same seat in every lecture hall. Always in the back. Always near an exit. Always where I could see the whole room. Same time for meals, same dining hall, often the same food. I became known as that super dedicated CS student. Professors loved me because I was always prepared, always on time, always had my assignments completed early. What they didn't know was that I was prepared because unpredictability sent me into internal panic mode, and early completion wasn't about being a good student. It was about avoiding the anxiety of last-minute deadlines. The ADHD medication was still helping with focus, but college introduced new challenges. Suddenly, I had to manage my own schedule, remember multiple deadlines, navigate complex social situations, and somehow figure out this thing called work-life balance that everyone kept talking about. I remember this one particular incident during my sophomore year that really showed me how different my brain was, even though I didn't understand it yet. There was this group project in one of my software engineering classes. 5 students, build a web application presentation at the end of the semester. I was so excited about this project. Finally, something that combined my technical skills with practical application. I immediately started sketching out the entire system architecture, planning the database schema, thinking through user interface flows. Within a week, I had created this incredibly detailed project plan, with timelines, milestones, and contingencies. My group members were less excited about my approach. "Dude, chill," said this guy Trevor. "It's just a class project. We don't need to build the next Facebook." But I couldn't chill. In my mind, there was a right way to do this project and a bunch of wrong ways, and I could see exactly what the right way looked like. When the group wanted to take shortcuts or skip steps that I thought were essential, I got increasingly frustrated. When they wanted to have brainstorming sessions, where everyone just threw out random ideas, I felt like my brain was going to explode. I ended up doing about 80% of the work myself, staying up until 3 a.m. night after night, perfecting every function, every interface, every edge case. The final product was honestly pretty impressive for a student project. We got an A, but my group members thought I was an obsessive control freak, and I thought they were lazy and sloppy. None of us understood that my brain literally works differently, that what looked like perfectionism to them was actually my autistic brain's need for systematic completion, and what looked like laziness to me was actually neurotypical brains being comfortable with good enough. This pattern repeated itself throughout college. I'd excel academically, especially in individual work, but struggle with collaborative projects and social aspects of university life. I started to think of myself as just not a team player, or better working alone. Dating was, well, let's just say it was a disaster wrapped in a catastrophe, topped with confusion sauce. I had this idea that college was when you were supposed to figure out relationships, so I tried. Oh man, did I try. I asked out this girl Sarah from my calculus class junior year. She said yes, which shocked me so much I almost forgot to suggest an actual activity for our date. I planned everything meticulously. Dinner at this quiet restaurant near campus. I had researched the menu, the noise levels, the seating arrangements. Then a movie, something I thought she'd like based on comments she'd made in class. I had conversation topics prepared, interesting facts about Austin to share, questions to ask her about her major. The date was fine. I followed my script. She seemed to enjoy herself, and at the end of the night she said, "We should do this again." Success, right? Wrong. Because I had no idea what this actually meant, or how to move from date 1 to date 2, or what the social expectations were for frequency of texting, or whether asking her out again immediately was eager or desperate. I spent 3 days crafting the perfect follow-up text message. I wrote and rewrote it, analyzing every word choice, every emoji option. By the time I sent it, a week had passed, and Sarah had apparently decided I wasn't interested. "You're just shy," my friend said. "You'll get the hang of it." But it wasn't shyness. It was like everyone else had been given a manual for human interaction that I somehow missed. I could debug the most complex code, solve mathematical proofs that stumped other students, but I couldn't figure out the basic social algorithms that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. I started observing couples around campus like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. How did they decide to become exclusive? How often were they supposed to text? What was the difference between hanging out and dating? When were you supposed to meet each other's friends? I developed what I thought were sophisticated strategies. I studied romantic comedies like textbooks, taking notes on dialogue and relationship progressions. I practiced conversations in the mirror. I created mental flowcharts for different social scenarios. It was exhausting, and it wasn't working. By senior year, I had basically given up on dating and focused entirely on academics and preparing for my career. I told myself I was just focused on my future, and that relationships would be easier once I was established professionally. I had no idea I was just delaying the inevitable crash. The thing about masking through college is that the structure actually helps a lot. Clear expectations, defined goals, measurable outcomes. I knew how to be a good student because the rules were mostly explicit. Show up to class, complete assignments, study for exams, maintain a certain GPA. Simple. But even within that structure, the cracks were showing. I had what I now recognize as regular burnouts, periods where I'd just shut down for days, unable to handle even basic self-care. I'd tell everyone I was just stressed about exams, or fighting off a cold. Really, I was hitting my sensory and social processing limits over and over again, without understanding what was happening or how to prevent it. I remember this one finals week spring semester of senior year. I had been pushing myself hard all semester, maintaining my 4.0 GPA, working as a teaching assistant, and applying for jobs. The weather was getting hot. Austin in May is brutal, and the campus was full of end-of-semester energy. Everyone was stressed, excited, loud. I was in the main library, trying to study for my final computer networks exam, when it just happened. The air conditioning was making this humming noise that seemed to get louder and louder. Someone was eating chips, very crunchy chips. A group of students was having a whispered conversation that wasn't actually whispered. The fluorescent lights were flickering just slightly, just enough to notice. All of these inputs combined into this overwhelming sensory storm. And I had what I now know was a meltdown, right there in the middle of the library. I packed up my stuff, walked to my car, sat in the parking lot, and cried for about an hour. Senioritis, I told myself, just stressed about graduation. But deep down, I knew something was different about me. Something that medication and good study habits and carefully planned routines couldn't fix. I graduated summa cum laude with a computer science degree and 3 job offers from Austin tech companies. Everyone was so proud. Jordan figured it out, they said. He found his path. What I had actually found was a really sophisticated way to hide my struggles, and I was about to spend the next decade getting really, really good at it. But first, I had to survive the transition from college structure to adult life. Spoiler alert, it didn't go smoothly. May 2012, I'm 22 years old, fresh out of UT with a computer science degree, and I just signed my first real job offer with a tech startup in Austin's Silicon Hills. The company was called Dataflow Solutions, one of those early big data companies that was riding the wave of Austin's tech boom. The salary was more money than I'd ever seen. The office was in this converted warehouse in East Austin with exposed brick walls and ping-pong tables, and I was finally going to be a real adult with a real career. I thought I had made it. The first day at Dataflow, I showed up 30 minutes early because being late to anything triggered immediate anxiety spiral for me. I was wearing this khakis and button-down combo that I thought looked professional software developer, but probably looked more like kid playing dress-up in his dad's clothes. My manager, this cool guy named Rick, with a beard and vintage band t-shirts, gave me the tour. Open office plan. About 40 developers in one big room, no walls, no barriers, just rows of desks with multiple monitors and the constant sound of mechanical keyboards clicking. There was music playing from speakers scattered around the room. People were talking across aisles, having impromptu meetings standing around desks, throwing stress balls back and forth. "This is your desk," Rick said, pointing to a spot right in the middle of everything. "We believe in collaborative development here. No ivory towers, everyone's accessible to everyone." I smiled and nodded, already calculating how many sensory inputs I was going to have to process simultaneously. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. But here's the thing. I was also genuinely excited. This was programming at scale, real software that real people would use, complex problems that required the kind of hyper-focus that came naturally to me. When I sat down at my workstation and saw the code base I'd be working on, it was like looking at a massive, beautiful puzzle that I couldn't wait to solve. For the first few months, the job was perfect. I was in what I now know was hyper-focus heaven. I would arrive at 7 a.m. when the office was mostly empty and quiet, code for hours without interruption, and produce work that honestly impressed everyone, including myself. Rick started giving me increasingly complex assignments, and I crushed every single one. "Jordan's our secret weapon," I overheard him telling another manager. "Kid can code for 10 hours straight and still be sharp at the end of the day." What Rick didn't know was that I wasn't sharp at the end of the day. I was completely depleted. I would drive home to my little apartment near Muller, collapse on my couch, and basically shut down until the next morning. I lived on takeout food because cooking felt like too much additional processing. I avoided social plans because I needed every evening to recover from the sensory assault of the open office. But professionally, I was killing it. Within 6 months, I got promoted to senior developer. Within a year, I was leading my own projects. My code was clean, efficient, and well documented. I met every deadline, anticipated problems before they happened, and had this reputation for being incredibly reliable. What I was actually doing was using my autistic brain's natural systematization abilities to excel in an environment that was designed around my interests, while slowly burning myself out with unsustainable masking and sensory overload. The social aspects of tech work in Austin were challenging. Austin's tech scene has this culture of work hard, play hard. After work happy hours at bars on East 6th Street, company parties at venues with loud music and crowds, team building events like laser tag or escape rooms, activities that sounded like torture to my nervous system, but that I felt obligated to attend to be seen as a team player. I developed what I thought were sophisticated strategies for these social situations. I'd show up, make an appearance, have exactly one beer to look normal, engage in small talk for precisely 45 minutes, then manufacture an excuse to leave early. Early morning tomorrow. Feeling a bit under the weather. My cat is sick. I didn't have a cat. My coworkers started calling me the ghost because I was so good at disappearing from social events. They thought it was charming and mysterious. Really, I was just trying to survive. Dating during this period was, well, let's call it a learning experience. Austin's dating scene is intense. There's this whole culture around food trucks and live music and outdoor festivals, and every dating app profile seemed to feature someone at ACL or SXSW or floating the river. All activities that sounded exhausting to me but that I felt I needed to pretend to enjoy. I matched with this woman named Jessica on Bumble who seemed perfect on paper. Software engineer at another Austin company, into hiking and reading, claimed to appreciate quiet nights in. We texted for weeks before meeting, and I felt like I was finally connecting with someone who might understand my lifestyle. Our first date was at Barton Springs Pool on a Sunday afternoon. If you don't know Barton Springs, it's this natural spring-fed pool right in the middle of Austin, where the water stays about 70 degrees year-round. Locals treat it like a community center. Families, college students, dogs, musicians, food vendors. Very Austin, very chill. For Jessica, it was relaxing. For me, it was sensory chaos. The sound of splashing water echoing off concrete walls, kids screaming and laughing, dogs barking, the smell of sunscreen and pool chemicals, the visual chaos of hundreds of people in various states of undress, all moving in unpredictable patterns. I spent the entire date in low-level sensory overload, trying to focus on our conversation while my nervous system was basically screaming at me to leave. Jessica was telling me about her work on mobile app development, and I'm sure it was interesting. But I could barely process what she was saying over the environmental noise. "Are you okay?" she asked about an hour in. "You seem distracted." "Just thinking about a work problem," I lied. "Sorry, I should be more present." But I couldn't be more present. My brain was using all its processing power just to function in that environment. There was nothing left over for meaningful social interaction. We dated for about 3 months. Jessica was patient with my quirks, my need to plan dates in advance, my preference for quiet restaurants, my tendency to suggest staying in rather than going out. But eventually, my inability to be spontaneous or flexible wore her down. "You're really sweet, Jordan," she said when she broke up with me over coffee at this quiet place on South Lamar. "But dating you feels like everything has to be on your terms. I need someone who can be more adaptable." She wasn't wrong. I did need everything to be on my terms, because deviating from my carefully constructed routines and environments sent me into internal chaos. But I didn't know that then. I just thought I was bad at relationships. This pattern repeated itself over and over. I'd meet someone. We'd connect intellectually, but my need for control and predictability would eventually become too much for them. I started thinking of myself as just not relationship material. Work, though. Work was where I thrived. Data flow was growing rapidly, and I grew with it. I became a team lead, then a senior architect, then eventually director of engineering. By the time I was 26, I was making 6 figures and had a reputation in Austin's tech community as one of the go-to people for complex back-end systems. The thing about hyperfocus is that it really can look like genius from the outside. I would disappear into coding problems for days at a time, emerging with elegant solutions that nobody else had thought of. I could see patterns in complex systems that eluded other developers. I had this almost supernatural ability to debug problems that had stumped entire teams. But the cost was enormous. I was working 60, 70-hour weeks not because the job required it, but because that's how my brain worked. I couldn't just work on something for an hour and then switch to something else. When I got into a coding flow state, I would stay there until the problem was completely solved, or until my body forced me to stop. My apartment during this period was basically a crash pad between work sessions. Minimal furniture, no decorations, just the essentials for basic survival. I ate the same rotation of takeout meals every week because making food decisions was one more cognitive load I couldn't handle. My social life consisted entirely of work relationships and the occasional family dinner, where my parents would ask if I was taking care of myself. "You work too hard," my mom would say. "You need to find balance." But I didn't know how to find balance. My brain didn't seem to have an intermediate setting between completely obsessed with work and too depleted to function. The burnouts started getting worse around year 3 at Dataflow. I'd push myself for months, delivering incredible work, building systems that impressed everyone, and then I'd just crash. Hard. I'd call in sick for days, sometimes a full week, telling everyone I had the flu or food poisoning. Really, I was having what I now recognize as autistic burnouts. Complete system shutdowns where I couldn't handle basic tasks like showering or grocery shopping, let alone writing code. I'd spend those weeks playing video games, ordering delivery food, and sleeping 12-14 hours a day until my nervous system recovered enough to function again. "Jordan just pushes himself too hard," Rick would tell other managers. "But when he's on, he's unstoppable." That became my identity, the brilliant but intense developer who worked in cycles of incredible productivity, followed by mysterious absences. People started planning around my patterns, giving me space during my down periods, and relying on me heavily during my up periods. What nobody realized, including me, was that this wasn't a personality quirk or a work-style choice. This was an autistic brain trying to function in a neurotypical world without the right support systems. The breaking point came during SXSW 2015. I was 25, had been at Dataflow for 3 years, and was being considered for a VP of engineering position. Part of the evaluation process involved representing the company at SXSW Interactive, networking with potential clients, attending panels, basically being the public face of our technical capabilities. If you remember my childhood SXSW trauma, you can probably guess how this went. The convention center during SXSW Interactive is sensory overload on steroids. Thousands of people, hundreds of booths with flashing screens and competing audio, the constant buzz of networking conversations, the smell of convention food, and too many people in a confined space. And I was supposed to not just survive this environment, but thrive in it professionally. I made it about 4 hours on the first day before I had a complete meltdown in a bathroom stall. Shaking, crying, the whole 9 yards. I texted Rick that I had food poisoning and fled back to my apartment, where I stayed for the next 3 days with the curtains drawn and noise-canceling headphones on. "Maybe Jordan's not ready for executive leadership," I overheard Rick telling the CEO a few weeks later. "He's got the technical skills, but he struggled with the business development side." They weren't wrong. I wasn't ready for executive leadership, not because I lacked technical ability, but because I didn't have the tools to manage my neurological differences in high-stress social environments. But I didn't know that then. I just thought I was weak, antisocial, maybe just not cut out for the kind of success I thought I wanted. The worst part was that Austin's tech community is actually incredibly supportive and inclusive compared to other cities. Companies here genuinely try to create positive work cultures. People are generally laid back and understanding, and there's real appreciation for different types of thinking. If I couldn't make it work in Austin, in a city that literally celebrates being weird, in an industry that values logical thinking, in a community that prides itself on acceptance, then maybe the problem really was just me. I started thinking that maybe I was just destined to be a brilliant individual contributor, but never a leader. Maybe I was just antisocial. Maybe I was just difficult. It would be another 6 years before I learned that none of that was true. But first, I had to hit rock bottom. Fast forward to March 2020. I'm 30 years old, still at Dataflow, now as principal engineer, making more money than I ever thought possible, and absolutely miserable. I'm sitting in my home office, a converted bedroom in the same Muller apartment I'd had for 8 years, staring at 3 monitors full of code that might as well be hieroglyphics. The pandemic had just hit Austin. SXSW got canceled for the first time in its history, and suddenly everyone was working from home. My coworkers were all complaining about missing the office, missing collaboration, missing the energy of being around people. I was secretly relieved. No more open office sensory chaos. No more forced social interactions. No more pretending to enjoy team lunches at loud restaurants. Just me, my code, and blessed silence. Except, I couldn't focus. At all. This was terrifying because focus had always been my superpower. Even during my worst burnout periods, I could still hyper-focus on programming problems. Code was my safe space, my flow state, my escape from the chaos of human interaction. If I couldn't code, what was I? I'd been taking the same ADHD medication, Adderall XR, for almost 15 years. Same dose, same routine, same reliable effect. Take it in the morning with coffee, focus intensely for 6-8 hours, crash in the evening, repeat. It wasn't perfect, but it worked well enough to build a successful career. But suddenly, it was like taking sugar pills. I'd sit down to work on a complex algorithm, take my usual dose, and nothing. My brain would jump from the code to checking email to random Wikipedia articles to wondering what was in my fridge to worrying about global pandemic statistics. The hyperfocus was just gone. I called my doctor, the same family practice physician who'd been prescribing my ADHD medication since college. "Sounds like you've built up a tolerance," Dr. Patterson said during our telehealth call. "Let's try increasing your dose, or maybe switching to a different stimulant." So we tried that. Higher doses of Adderall, then Ritalin, then Vyvanse. Each medication would work for a few weeks, giving me brief windows of that familiar hyperfocus, and then the effect would fade again. It was like my brain had decided to reject the very thing that had made my professional life possible. The worst part was that everything else in my life was actually getting better. Working from home eliminated most of my daily sensory stressors. No commute traffic, no open office noise, no forced social interactions. I could control my environment completely. Perfect lighting, comfortable temperature, no unexpected interruptions. I should have been thriving. Instead, I was falling apart in slow motion. My work performance started slipping for the first time in my career. Projects that should have taken me a week were stretching into months. I'd sit in virtual meetings, trying to look engaged while my brain ping-ponged between anxiety about falling behind and confusion about why medication that had worked for over a decade was suddenly ineffective. "Jordan seems distracted lately," I overheard Rick saying during a Zoom call where he thought his mic was muted. Maybe the isolation is getting to him. But it wasn't isolation. I loved the isolation. What was killing me was the growing realization that everything I thought I knew about my brain was wrong. I started researching obsessively, which, looking back, was probably my first major special interest that wasn't computer-related. I read everything I could find about ADHD medication tolerance, alternative treatments, brain chemistry, neurodevelopment. I fell down rabbit holes about dopamine receptors and executive function disorders and cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's when the algorithm started showing me content about autism. Now, I need to explain something about my relationship with social media. I'm not a big Instagram or Facebook person. Too much social noise, too many unpredictable emotional inputs. But TikTok became my pandemic obsession. The algorithm was scary good at showing me exactly the kind of content my brain craved. Technical explanations, pattern recognition, systematic breakdowns of complex topics. At first, it was just ADHD content. Videos explaining executive dysfunction, tips for managing hyperfocus, people sharing their experiences with medication adjustments. I related to a lot of it, but something was missing. These creators were describing ADHD experiences that overlapped with mine, but weren't quite right. Then, in August 2020, the algorithm showed me a video that changed everything. It was this woman named Alex, probably in her early 30s, sitting in what looked like a very carefully organized home office. The caption read, "Signs you might be autistic that have nothing to do with social skills." I almost scrolled past it. I thought I knew what autism looked like. Rain Man, socially awkward kids who didn't make eye contact, people who couldn't function independently. That wasn't me. I lived alone, had a successful career, could make small talk when necessary. But something made me pause and watch. "Number one," Alex said, "you have intense interests that you can focus on for hours, to the point where you forget to eat or use the bathroom." Oh, like my 12-hour coding sessions where I'd forget the outside world existed. "Number two, you've always felt like everyone else got a social manual that you missed." the dating disasters, the carefully studied conversation scripts, the exhaustion from pretending to be someone I wasn't. Number 3. You need routines and predictability to function, and unexpected changes throw off your entire day. My elaborate morning rituals, my anxiety when plans changed, my need to eat the same foods, take the same routes, sit in the same seats. Number 4. You have sensory sensitivities that other people don't seem to notice or understand. SXSW, open offices, scratchy clothing tags, fluorescent lights, the way certain sounds made my skin crawl. And number 5. You might have been diagnosed with ADHD, but medication only helps with some of your symptoms, not all of them. I felt like Alex was talking directly to me through my phone screen. I watched that video probably 20 times that day. Then I fell down the rabbit hole of autism content, specifically content by and for autistic adults who had been diagnosed later in life. The more I watched, the more pieces started clicking into place. These creators were describing my entire life experience with an accuracy that was honestly disturbing. The masking, the burnouts, the sensory issues, the social exhaustion, the way I could be incredibly successful in narrow areas while struggling with things that seemed basic to everyone else. But the thing that really got me was a video about autism in the workplace. This creator was talking about hyperfocus as an autistic trait, not just an ADHD trait. About how autistic people often excel in technical fields because their brains naturally systematize and pattern match. About how many successful software developers, engineers, and scientists are actually undiagnosed autistics who found careers that worked with their neurological differences. Wait, I said out loud to my empty apartment. What if I'm not actually good at programming despite being weird? What if I'm good at programming because I'm autistic? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times people had called me intense, or obsessive, or difficult. All the relationships that had failed because I was too rigid or couldn't go with the flow. All the social situations where I'd felt like an alien trying to blend in with humans. What if none of that was character flaws? What if it was just neurodivergence? I started taking online autism assessments. Not the official diagnostic ones, just the screening tools that various autism organizations provide. The Autism Spectrum Quotient, the Ritvo Autism Asperger Diagnostic Scale, the Camouflaging Autistic Traits Questionnaire. Every single one came back with scores that were not just above the threshold for likely autistic, but significantly above it. But here's the thing that really messed with my head. I was clearly not what people typically think of as autistic. I could make eye contact when I remembered to. I could engage in small talk when I had prepared topics. I lived independently, had a successful career, could navigate most social situations without obvious problems. Then I learned about masking. Masking, for those who don't know, is when autistic people unconsciously or consciously camouflage their natural behaviors to blend in with neurotypical social expectations. It's like performing a character of what you think a normal person would do in any given situation. Everything I'd spent my life thinking of as sophisticated social skills were actually masking behaviors. The conversation scripts I'd memorized, the careful observation of other people's facial expressions and body language, the exhaustion I felt after any social interaction, the way I could be on professionally but needed hours of isolation to recover. I wasn't bad at being human. I was autistic, and I'd been working overtime for 30 years to hide it. The rabbit hole got deeper. I learned about different autism presentations, that autism in adults often looks different than autism in children, that autistic women and girls often mask more effectively than autistic boys, that intelligent autistic people can develop incredibly sophisticated coping mechanisms that hide their support needs. I learned about level 2 autism, requiring substantial support, and how that can manifest in adults who appear high-functioning, but are actually struggling with significant executive functioning, sensory processing, and social communication challenges. I learned about the connection between autism and ADHD, that they're frequently comorbid conditions, that ADHD symptoms can mask underlying autistic traits, and that stimulant medications often work differently in autistic brains than in purely ADHD brains. Suddenly, everything made sense. The medication wasn't working anymore because it had never been addressing the core issue. My ADHD was just one part of a more complex neurological profile that included autism. By October 2020, I was pretty convinced I was autistic. But knowing something and getting it officially confirmed are two very different things, especially when you're a 30-year-old adult in Texas who doesn't fit the stereotypical autism presentation. I started researching autism diagnosticians in Austin. Turns out, most of them specialize in children. The few who work with adults had waiting lists that stretched months or even years into the future. And many of them weren't trained to recognize autism in adults who had been successfully masking for decades. I finally found Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a neuropsychologist who specialized in adult autism diagnosis and had specific experience with tech professionals. Her practice was in Central Austin, and she had a cancellation that got me an appointment in December 2020. "What brings you here today?" Dr. Hendricks asked during our initial consultation. I had prepared for this question, of course. I had a whole list of examples and experiences organized chronologically. But when I actually tried to explain it, the words came out in a jumbled rush. I think I might be autistic, and also I can't focus anymore even with ADHD medication. And I've been watching these TikTok videos that describe my entire life, and nothing has ever made sense before, but this makes sense. And I don't know if I'm just having a pandemic-induced mental health crisis or if I've actually been autistic this whole time and just didn't know it. Dr. Hendricks smiled. A kind, understanding smile that told me she'd heard variations of this story before. "Let's start at the beginning," she said. "Tell me about your childhood." What followed was the most thorough examination of my life that I'd ever experienced. Detailed questionnaires about my developmental history, sensory experiences, social relationships, work patterns, and daily functioning. Cognitive assessments that tested my executive functioning, social communication skills, and pattern recognition abilities. The process took 3 sessions over 6 weeks. 3 sessions where I systematically unpacked 30 years of experiences that I'd never really examined through the lens of neurodivergence. By the end of it, I was emotionally exhausted but also oddly hopeful. For the first time in my life, someone was taking my struggles seriously instead of dismissing them as personality quirks or character flaws. On January 15, 2021, my 31st birthday, ironically, Dr. Hendricks called me with the results. "Jordan," she said, "based on your assessment results and clinical presentation, I'm diagnosing you with autism spectrum disorder, requiring substantial support, what we call level 2, as well as confirming your existing ADHD diagnosis." I sat in my home office, staring out the window at the Austin skyline, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. I wasn't broken. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't antisocial or weird or impossible to love. I was autistic, and for the first time in 31 years, that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. January 15th, 2021. My 31st birthday. I'm sitting in my home office, still processing Dr. Hendricks' words. Autism spectrum disorder, level 2, requiring substantial support. You know what's funny? My first thought wasn't relief or sadness or fear. It was, well, that explains why my apartment looks like this. I looked around my supposedly adult living space. Minimal furniture, no decorations, the same basic setup I'd had since college. Everything arranged for maximum efficiency and minimum sensory input. No art on the walls because I couldn't handle making aesthetic decisions. No plants because I'd forget to water them. Just the essentials for basic survival between work sessions. I'd always felt like I was failing at being an adult compared to my peers, who had beautifully decorated homes and seemed to effortlessly maintain social lives and romantic relationships. Turns out, I wasn't failing at being an adult. I was succeeding at being an autistic adult, I just didn't know that was what I was doing. Dr. Hendricks had explained that level 2 autism means I need substantial support in social communication and restricted, repetitive behaviors. In practical terms, this meant that while I could function independently in many areas, I had significant challenges that required more support than what's typically considered high-functioning autism. Many adults with your profile, she explained, develop sophisticated masking strategies that allow them to appear more independent than they actually are. The cost is usually exhaustion, burnout, and mental health challenges. That hit hard. I thought about all those years of pushing myself to the brink, all those mysterious flu weeks where I couldn't function. All those failed relationships where I was accused of being too rigid or emotionally unavailable. I wasn't too rigid. I had substantial support needs around routine and predictability that I didn't know how to communicate or advocate for. I wasn't emotionally unavailable. I was using all my emotional energy just to mask my autistic traits and navigate social situations that were genuinely overwhelming for my nervous system. The ADHD piece made sense too. Dr. Hendricks explained that about 50–70% of autistic people also have ADHD, and that the conditions can mask each other in complex ways. My hyperfocus wasn't just ADHD, it was the intersection of ADHD hyperfocus and autistic special interests. My executive functioning challenges weren't just ADHD. They were the compounding effect of trying to manage both neurological differences simultaneously. The reason your ADHD medication stopped working effectively, she said, is probably because you're experiencing autistic burnout. When autistic people push beyond their capacity for extended periods, the entire nervous system becomes dysregulated. Stimulant medications often become less effective during these periods. This explained so much. The pandemic hadn't caused my focus issues. It had just removed the external structure and social pressure that was forcing me to function beyond my actual capacity. Without the artificial supports of office routine and professional expectations, my real support needs became impossible to ignore. After the diagnosis call, I did what any self-respecting software developer would do. I created a comprehensive spreadsheet to analyze my entire life through this new lens. Column A, life event or pattern. Column B, previous explanation. Column C, autism, ADHD explanation. Column D, evidence examples. Childhood meltdowns during SXSW. He's just overstimulated. Sensory processing differences. Plus executive dysfunction. Documented pattern every March for years. Difficulty with romantic relationships. He's just not relationship material. Unrecognized support needs plus masking exhaustion. Multiple relationships ending with similar complaints about rigidity, work, hyperfocus. He's just really dedicated. Autistic special interests plus ADHD hyperfocus. 12-hour coding sessions. Forgetting to eat. Social exhaustion. He's just introverted. Masking plus. Social processing demands. Needing days to recover from social events. The spreadsheet eventually had over 200 entries. 31 years of experiences that had never made sense suddenly formed a coherent pattern. But knowing and accepting are two different things. The first few months after diagnosis were complicated. On one hand, there was enormous relief. Finally, an explanation for why life felt so much harder for me than it seemed for everyone else. Finally, a framework for understanding my needs instead of just feeling like I was constantly failing at being human. On the other hand, there was grief. Grief for all the years I'd spent thinking I was broken. Grief for the relationships that might have worked if I'd understood my needs. Grief for the career opportunities I'd passed up because I thought I wasn't leadership material. Grief for the self-compassion I'd never allowed myself. There's actually a term for this. Diagnostic grief. It's common among adults who receive late autism diagnoses. You mourn the life you might have had if you'd known earlier, while simultaneously feeling grateful to finally understand yourself. I started therapy with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, no relation to my childhood Dr. Martinez, who specialized in supporting newly diagnosed autistic adults. The first few sessions were just me processing the emotional aftermath of 3 decades of misunderstanding myself. I keep thinking about all the times people called me difficult or high maintenance, I told her during one session. What if they were right? What if I am just too much work? Jordan, Dr. Martinez said gently, needing support doesn't make you too much work. It makes you human. Autistic humans have different support needs than neurotypical humans, but that doesn't make those needs less valid. This was revolutionary for me. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to minimize my impact on other people, to be as low maintenance as possible, to never ask for accommodations or special consideration. The idea that I could actually communicate my needs and expect reasonable people to work with them was completely foreign. We started with small things. I told my manager Rick about my diagnosis, not asking for special treatment, just explaining some of my work patterns and communication preferences. That actually makes a lot of sense, Rick said when I explained about sensory processing and the need for quiet focus time. I always wondered why you were so much more productive when the office was empty. Do you need anything specific to work better from home? That conversation led to formal accommodations through HR. Flexible hours that let me work during my optimal focus times. Written communication for complex instructions instead of verbal briefings. The option to skip non-essential meetings that involved a lot of social coordination but minimal technical content. For the first time in my career, I wasn't just surviving at work. I was thriving with support. The dating thing was harder. How do you explain to potential partners that you're autistic when most people's understanding of autism comes from movies and TV shows that bear no resemblance to your actual experience? I tried a few different approaches. The casual mention, "Oh, by the way, I'm autistic," usually led to confused looks and questions about whether I meant something else. The detailed explanation usually felt like oversharing on a first date. The gradual revelation after several dates often led to people feeling like I'd been hiding something significant. Finally, I decided to just be upfront about it in my dating profile. Autistic software developer, who's probably more interesting than your average neurotypical guy. I make great playlists, give excellent back rubs, and will never judge you for having weird interests because mine are definitely weirder. This approach filtered out people who weren't compatible with my neurological reality and attracted people who were either neurodivergent themselves or had experience with neurodivergent partners. That's how I met Rachel. Rachel was a librarian at the Austin Public Library, 3 years older than me, and had an autistic younger brother. When we matched on Hinge, her first message was, "Your profile mentions being autistic. My brother is too. Want to skip the small talk and tell me about your current special interest?" I wrote her a 500-word message about database optimization algorithms. She responded with an equally detailed explanation of library science cataloging systems. We texted for 2 weeks before meeting, covering everything from sensory preferences to communication styles to what we each needed in relationships. Our first date was at the Bullock, Texas State History Museum on a Tuesday afternoon. My suggestion because museums during off-peak hours are perfect autism-friendly environments. Controlled sensory input, interesting information to discuss, clear structure and timeline. "This is the most comfortable first date I've ever been on," Rachel said as we looked at an exhibit about early Texas technology. "You actually listen when I talk about library cataloging instead of just waiting for your turn to speak." "Well," I said, "organizing information into searchable systems is objectively fascinating. Plus, you explain things really clearly, which I appreciate because sometimes I miss social subtext." "What if we just kept communicating this directly?" she suggested. "Like, what if we skip the part where we pretend to be neurotypical for each other?" That was 2 years ago. We're still together, still communicating directly, and I'm learning what it feels like to be in a relationship where I don't have to mask. The autism community in Austin, it turns out, is surprisingly robust. There's the Austin Autism Society, which offers support groups for adults. There's an informal meetup group for autistic professionals in tech. There are sensory-friendly events at local venues and autism-friendly activities around the city. For the first time in my life, I found myself in spaces where my natural communication style was not just accepted but preferred, where people understood the need for clear expectations and honest feedback, where nobody expected me to make small talk or engage in neurotypical social rituals that felt exhausting and pointless. "I wish I'd found this community 10 years ago," I told Rachel after my first autism support group meeting. "But you found it when you were ready," she pointed out. "You needed to understand yourself first, before you could connect with others who share your experiences." She was right. At 21 or 25 or even 28, I wouldn't have been ready to accept that I needed community or support. I was too invested in the idea that I could figure everything out on my own, too afraid that asking for help would reveal some fundamental weakness. Now I understand that community isn't about weakness. It's about recognizing that humans are social creatures, even autistic humans, and that we all function better when we're surrounded by people who understand and accept our neurological reality. The diagnosis also helped me understand my family dynamics in new ways. I called my parents a few weeks after getting the official results. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that I got diagnosed with autism and ADHD. It explains a lot about my childhood and why I've always been different." There was a long pause. Then, "Honey, We always knew you were special. We just didn't know there was a name for it. Are you okay with this? I asked. I know it's not what you expected when you said I'd do well in Austin because the city loves weird people. Jordan, my dad chimed in from the background. We've been proud of you for 31 years. Learning that you're autistic doesn't change that. If anything, it makes us even more impressed with everything you've accomplished. That conversation helped me realize that the people who truly love me had always accepted my neurodivergent traits, even when none of us had the language to describe them. The diagnosis didn't change who I was. It just gave me and the people around me better tools to understand and support that person. By the end of 2021, my life looked completely different. Same job, same apartment, same basic routine, but with a fundamentally different understanding of myself and my needs. I wasn't trying to fix or hide my autistic traits anymore. I was learning to work with them. And for the first time in 31 years, that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Spring 2022. I'm sitting in my therapist's office, the first time I'd met Dr. Martinez in person after a year of telehealth sessions. And she asked me a question that stops me cold. Jordan, who are you when nobody's watching? I sat there for probably 2 full minutes, just staring at her. Not because I didn't understand the question, but because I genuinely didn't know the answer. For 31 years, I'd been so focused on figuring out how to be the person I thought other people wanted me to be, that I'd never really explored who I actually was underneath all that performance. I don't know, I finally admitted. I've been masking for so long that I'm not sure where the mask ends and I begin. This is the weird thing about getting an autism diagnosis as an adult. You'd think it would immediately make everything easier. Like, now you know what's going on, so you can just start being yourself, right? Wrong. So very wrong. Unmasking, the process of stopping the automatic camouflaging behaviors you've developed to appear neurotypical, is honestly one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. It's like deciding to take off a suit of armor while you're still in the middle of a battle. The first thing I had to figure out was what was actually me versus what was learned behavior. Take eye contact, for example. I'd spent decades training myself to make appropriate eye contact during conversations, because I'd learned that people interpret lack of eye contact as rudeness or dishonesty. But when I paid attention to what felt natural, I realized that eye contact was actually incredibly overwhelming for me. Looking directly at someone's face while also trying to process their words, their tone, their facial expressions, and formulate my own response was like trying to solve calculus problems while someone's shining a flashlight in your eyes. So I started an experiment. What if I just didn't force eye contact during conversations? The first time I tried this was during a one-on-one meeting with Rick at work. Instead of staring at his face while he talked about project timelines, I looked at his shoulder, or at my notes, or at the window behind him. I found I could actually focus on what he was saying instead of managing the sensory overwhelm of direct eye contact. "Are you okay, Jordan?" Rick asked about halfway through the meeting. "You seem distracted." This was the moment of truth. Old Jordan would have immediately snapped back to forced eye contact and apologized for seeming inattentive. New Jordan decided to try something radical. Honesty. "Actually, I focus better when I'm not making direct eye contact," I said. "It's an autism thing. I'm listening more carefully when I'm looking somewhere else, not less." Rick paused, visibly processing this information. "Huh. Okay. Whatever works for you." And that was it. No big dramatic moment, no pushback, no judgment. Just acknowledgement and acceptance. This became a pattern. Each time I stopped forcing myself to perform neurotypical behaviors and started doing what felt natural, I expected some kind of social catastrophe. Instead, most people just adapted. The stimming was harder to unmask because I'd suppressed it so completely for so long. You know how when you hold your breath underwater for too long, when you finally surface, you don't just breathe normally. You gasp? That's what happened when I stopped suppressing my natural movement patterns. Suddenly, I was fidgeting constantly, tapping pens, bouncing my leg, playing with fidget toys, rocking slightly in my chair. All the movement that I'd learned to suppress in elementary school came flooding back. Rachel was the first person to notice. We were watching a movie at her apartment, and I was unconsciously running my fingers along the seam of the couch cushion, over and over, because the texture was soothing. "That's new," she said gently. "The fidgeting. I immediately stopped and felt embarrassed. Sorry, I didn't realize I was doing it. Don't apologize, she said. I was just noticing that you seem more yourself lately, more relaxed. That hit me hard. I was more myself. For the first time in my adult life, I was letting my natural behaviors emerge instead of constantly monitoring and correcting them. Work was where unmasking felt most risky. I'd built my entire professional identity around being the reliable, low-maintenance, easy-to-work-with technical expert. What if people discovered that underneath that performance, I was actually someone with complex support needs and communication preferences? I started small. I stopped forcing myself to participate in casual office chat during video calls. Instead of pretending to enjoy team happy hours, I started politely declining with honest explanations. Large groups and loud environments are overwhelming for me, but I'd love to grab coffee one-on-one with anyone who wants to connect. I requested accommodations that I'd never felt comfortable asking for before. Written agendas for meetings so I could prepare mentally. The ability to take breaks during long video calls to prevent sensory overload. Permission to work with noise-canceling headphones during focus time. Each accommodation felt like a risk. What if people thought I was high maintenance? What if they decided I wasn't worth the extra effort? Instead, something unexpected happened. My work quality improved dramatically. When I wasn't spending mental energy on masking, I had more cognitive resources available for actual problem solving. When I could structure my environment to meet my sensory needs, I could focus more deeply. When I could communicate directly instead of through neurotypical social filters, my technical explanations became clearer and more useful. Jordan's been on fire lately, I overheard Rick telling another manager. I don't know what changed, but his output quality has gone through the roof. What changed was that I stopped using 30% of my brain power on performing neurotypicality and started using 100% of it on being really good at my job. But unmasking wasn't just about work and casual social interactions. It was about fundamentally re-examining every relationship and commitment in my life. I had to figure out which friendships were based on genuine connection versus shared masking experiences. I had to evaluate which activities I actually enjoyed versus activities I'd convinced myself I should enjoy. Take live music, for example. Austin is the live music capital of the world, and I'd spent years forcing myself to attend concerts and festivals because that's what you do when you live here. I developed elaborate strategies for surviving these events. Earplugs, positioning near exits, taking breaks in bathrooms or outside venues. But when I really examined it, I didn't actually enjoy live music. The crowds, the unpredictable volume changes, the sensory chaos. It was all just stress for me. What I enjoyed was listening to music in controlled environments, where I could focus on the technical aspects of composition and production. So I stopped going to concerts. I stopped pretending to be excited about ACL lineup announcements. I stopped feeling guilty about wasting Austin's music scene. Instead, I started exploring the parts of Austin culture that actually aligned with my interests and sensory preferences. The tech meetups and makerspaces. The quiet coffee shops with good acoustics. The museums and libraries and bookstores. The early morning walks around Lady Bird Lake before the crowds arrived. I discovered that Austin had plenty of autism-friendly culture. I'd just been too focused on forcing myself to enjoy the neurotypical highlights to notice the alternatives. Dating while unmasking was its own special challenge. Rachel and I had started dating after my diagnosis, so she'd never known the fully masked version of me. But I still found myself falling into old patterns, trying to be the charming, adaptable, low-maintenance partner that I thought she wanted. "You know you don't have to perform for me, right?" she said one evening when I was clearly struggling through a dinner at a restaurant that was too loud and crowded for my comfort level. "I just want to be a good boyfriend," I said. "I don't want my autism to make things difficult for you." "Jordan," she said firmly, "you being authentically yourself doesn't make things difficult for me. You pretending to be someone else makes things difficult for both of us." That conversation led to a complete overhaul of how we approached our relationship. Instead of me trying to guess what she wanted and adapting myself accordingly, we started communicating directly about our needs and preferences. I told her that I needed advance notice for social plans because last-minute changes triggered anxiety. She told me that she needed regular verbal affirmation because her previous relationship had involved a lot of criticism. I explained that I process conflict differently and need time to think through disagreements before discussing them. She explained that she prefers to address issues immediately rather than letting them build up. We created systems that worked for both our neurological styles. Shared calendars for planning, regular check-ins about relationship satisfaction, clear protocols for handling sensory overload or social exhaustion. For the first time in my life, I was in a relationship where I didn't have to choose between being myself and being loved. The hardest part of unmasking was dealing with other people's reactions to the new me. Some friends and family members struggled with the changes. "You used to be so easygoing," my mom said during a visit when I declined to join a large family gathering at a noisy restaurant. "Now you seem so particular about everything." I realized that what she'd interpreted as easygoing was actually me suppressing my needs and preferences to avoid conflict. The particular version was just me advocating for my actual comfort and well-being. "I'm the same person, Mom," I told her. "I'm just not hiding my needs anymore." Some work colleagues had similar reactions. People who were used to the version of me that never complained, never asked for accommodations, never pushed back on assignments or expectations were confused by this new version who had opinions and boundaries. A few people pushed back directly. "You never used to be so sensitive about noise," or "You used to be more flexible about meeting times." Each time, I had to remind myself that their discomfort with my authenticity wasn't my responsibility. I couldn't control whether other people preferred the masked version of me, but I could control whether I continued to exhaust myself performing for their comfort. The surprising thing was how many people responded positively to the unmasked version. Colleagues started coming to me with more complex technical problems because they knew I'd give them direct, detailed feedback instead of polite deflection. Friends appreciated that they always knew where they stood with me because I'd stopped using indirect communication. "You seem so much more confident lately," Rachel observed about 6 months into my unmasking process. "Like you actually trust that people will like the real you." She was right. For 31 years, I'd operated from the assumption that the real me wasn't acceptable, that I needed to be constantly monitoring and adjusting my behavior to avoid rejection. Learning to trust that some people would accept and even prefer my authentic self was revolutionary. But unmasking isn't a linear process. Even now, 2 years later, I still catch myself falling into old masking patterns, especially in high-stress or unfamiliar social situations. The difference is that now I recognize when it's happening and can make conscious choices about when masking serves me versus when it's just automatic self-protection. I also learned that there's a difference between masking for survival and code switching for context. I still adjust my communication style when I'm giving a presentation to executives versus talking with other developers. But now those adjustments are strategic choices, rather than desperate attempts to hide my neurological reality. The goal isn't to never mask, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. The goal is to mask consciously when it serves your purposes, rather than unconsciously as a default state. That distinction was huge for me. I could still be professional in work contexts, diplomatic in family situations, and socially appropriate in public spaces. But I could also be authentically autistic in all those contexts, with accommodations and communication strategies that supported my actual needs. Unmasking taught me that I'm not actually difficult, or high maintenance, or too much work. I just have different needs than neurotypical people, and when those needs are met, I'm actually a pretty delightful person to be around. Who knew? If you're an autistic adult who's been masking for years or decades, I want you to know that unmasking is terrifying but also incredibly liberating. You don't have to do it all at once, and you don't have to do it in every context immediately. Start small, start safe, and remember that anyone who prefers the masked version of you over your authentic self isn't your person anyway. The most unexpected part of unmasking was discovering that I actually like myself. For 31 years I'd been trying to fix, hide, or apologize for my autistic traits. Now I was learning that those same traits were actually some of my best qualities. My hyperfocus wasn't obsessive, it was passionate dedication. My need for routine wasn't rigid, it was self-care. My direct communication wasn't rude, it was honest and efficient. My sensory sensitivities weren't weakness, they were heightened awareness that made me better at my job. Reframing my autistic traits as neutral differences rather than character flaws, was probably the most healing part of this whole process. But I still had a long way to go in learning how to build a life that actually worked for my brain. By early 2023, I had figured out who I was underneath the mask. The next challenge was building a life that actually worked for that person. This meant everything had to change. My daily routines, my social circle, my living space, my work habits, my relationship with my city. I was essentially redesigning my entire existence around my actual needs, instead of around what I thought other people expected from me. Let me start with the apartment situation, because that's where the changes were most visible. Remember my sparse, minimal living space that I'd had for almost a decade? Turns out, that wasn't sophisticated minimalism. That was sensory overwhelm avoidance and executive dysfunction accommodation. I'd been living in what was essentially a recovery space between work sessions, not an actual home. With Rachel's help, I started thinking about what my living environment would look like if it was designed for an autistic brain instead of just tolerated by one. First priority, lighting. I'd been living with harsh overhead fluorescents for years because I thought that was just normal apartment lighting. But fluorescent lights trigger sensory issues for a lot of autistic people. The imperceptible flickering, the slight humming, the artificial spectrum. We replaced everything with LED lights on dimmer switches. Warm, controllable, flicker-free lighting that I could adjust based on my sensory needs throughout the day. The difference was immediate and dramatic. I didn't realize how much low-level stress those fluorescents had been causing until they were gone. Next, sound management. Austin is not a quiet city. Traffic from I-35, construction noise, neighbors with different schedules, the constant hum of air conditioning units working overtime in Texas heat. I installed sound dampening panels on the walls, not enough to turn my apartment into a recording studio, but enough to take the edge off the ambient noise that had been constantly triggering my nervous system. Texture and organization became priorities too. I got rid of clothing with scratchy tags, rough seams, or fabrics that felt overwhelming against my skin. I organized my space so that everything had a specific place, and finding daily necessities didn't require decision-making energy. The kitchen got a complete overhaul. Instead of the random collection of mismatched dishes and appliances I'd accumulated over the years, I invested in tools that made food preparation less overwhelming. A rice cooker for consistent textures. Glass containers for storing leftovers so I could see what was in them. A system for meal planning that reduced daily food decisions. "It looks like a real person lives here now," Rachel said after we finished the apartment transformation. "Like someone who actually enjoys being home." She was right. For the first time in my adult life, my living space felt like a sanctuary instead of just a place to crash between obligations. Work changes were more complex because they involved other people and company policies. But Dataflow had been pretty accommodating about my initial requests, so I decided to push for more comprehensive accommodations. I worked with HR to formalize my support needs. Flexible hours that aligned with my natural energy patterns. I'm most focused between 6 a.m. and 2 p.m., so why force myself to work a standard 9 to 5 schedule? Written communication for complex instructions instead of verbal briefings that I'd struggle to process and remember accurately. The big one was requesting a private office space for when we eventually returned to in-person work. Open offices are sensory hell for most autistic people, but they're so common in tech that most companies don't even consider alternatives. "We've been thinking about switching to a hybrid model anyway," Rick told me when I explained my need for a controlled work environment. "Having some private offices for deep focus work makes sense for everyone, not just people with autism." That conversation led to Dataflow redesigning their entire office layout. They created quiet zones, provided noise-canceling headphones for anyone who wanted them, installed adjustable lighting, and established focus time protocols where interruptions were minimized. The accommodations I requested for my autism ended up improving the work environment for everyone. Neurotypical colleagues started using the quiet zones for complex tasks. The written communication protocols reduced misunderstandings across the team. The flexible hours improved work-life balance for parents and people with long commutes. This is something I've learned about autism accommodations. They're usually good for everyone, not just autistic people. Better lighting, clearer communication, reduced sensory chaos, more predictable schedules. These things benefit every type of brain. But the biggest life change was how I approached social connections and community building. For 31 years, I'd been trying to force myself into neurotypical social spaces and wondering why I always felt exhausted and out of place. Now I started seeking out specifically neurodivergent communities and autism-friendly activities. The Austin Autism Society became my gateway to understanding that I wasn't the only adult dealing with these challenges. Their monthly support group meetings were held at the Central Library in a quiet room with controlled lighting and clear meeting structures. No forced eye contact, no small talk requirements, just honest conversation about navigating the world with autistic brains. I thought I was the only person who needed 3 days to recover from a single social event, said Maria, another group member who worked in tech. Hearing that other people have the same experience makes me feel so much less broken. That's what community gave me. The understanding that my experiences weren't character flaws, but shared neurological differences. The validation that needing support wasn't weakness, but self-awareness. I also discovered Austin's network of neurodivergent professionals. There's an informal meetup group for autistic people in tech that meets monthly at different quiet venues around the city. No networking pressure, no forced socialization, just technical conversations with people who communicate in similar ways. This is what I wish all professional networking was like, I told Rachel after my first meetup. Everyone just talks directly about what they're working on without all the social performance. Through these communities, I learned about autism-friendly events happening around Austin. The Bullock Museum's sensory-friendly hours. Movie theaters that offer autism-friendly screenings with reduced volume and lighting. Restaurants that were understanding about dietary restrictions and sensory needs. I started mapping out an entirely different version of Austin than the one I'd been trying to force myself to enjoy. Instead of fighting my way through SXSW crowds, I could explore the city's makerspaces and hackathons. Instead of enduring loud bars on East 6th Street, I could enjoy quiet coffee shops and bookstores. Instead of struggling through ACL, I could attend smaller, controlled music events or just enjoy recorded music in sensory-friendly environments. Keep Austin Weird suddenly made sense to me in a completely different way. The city's culture of celebrating differences and individual expression wasn't just about artistic creativity. It was about making space for all kinds of neurological diversity. Food became a major focus of my life redesign. I'd spent years either ignoring my food preferences or feeling guilty about them. Many autistic people have specific dietary needs related to texture, temperature, flavor intensity, or digestive sensitivities. I definitely fell into this category but had been too embarrassed to acknowledge it. With Rachel's encouragement, I started paying attention to what foods actually worked for my body and brain instead of what I thought I should be eating. I discovered that I function much better with consistent meal timing, familiar textures, and foods that don't require a lot of sensory processing to eat. Austin's food scene, it turns out, is incredibly accommodating if you know how to navigate it. Food trucks are perfect for people who need to see exactly what they're ordering and don't want surprises. Many restaurants are happy to make modifications for dietary restrictions. The farmers' markets provide access to fresh, simple ingredients without the sensory overwhelm of large grocery stores. I developed a rotation of restaurants and food sources that worked for my sensory and nutritional needs. Instead of feeling limited by my food preferences, I started seeing them as useful information about how to fuel my brain effectively. Exercise was another area that needed complete restructuring. I'd spent years trying to force myself to enjoy gyms, group fitness classes, and team sports because that's what healthy adults were supposed to do. All of these environments were sensory nightmares for me. Loud music, unpredictable schedules, social pressure, crowded spaces. But when I examined what kinds of physical activity actually felt good to my nervous system, I discovered a completely different approach to fitness. Early morning walks around Lady Bird Lake when the trails were mostly empty. Swimming at Barton Springs during off-peak hours when the crowds were minimal. Rock climbing at indoor gyms during quiet times when I could focus on the technical problem-solving aspects. "You seem so much more relaxed lately," my mom observed during a family visit. "Like you're not constantly fighting against yourself." That was exactly it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't constantly fighting against my own neurological wiring. I was working with it instead of around it. The relationship with Rachel deepened as we both learned how to build a partnership that honored both our neurological styles. She's neurotypical, but has a lot of experience with neurodivergent family members, so she understood the importance of direct communication and structured support. We developed systems that worked for both of us. Shared calendars that gave me the advance notice I needed for social plans. Regular relationship check-ins where we could address issues before they became problems. Clear protocols for managing my sensory overload or her need for spontaneous social connection. I love that I never have to guess what you're thinking, Rachel told me one evening. You just tell me directly. It's so much easier than trying to read social cues and hoping I'm interpreting them correctly. Our relationship became proof that autism isn't a barrier to deep connection. It's just a different communication style that requires understanding and accommodation. By the summer of 2023, my life looked completely different from the outside, but more importantly, it felt completely different from the inside. I wasn't constantly exhausted from masking. I wasn't regularly hitting burnout cycles. I wasn't dreading social obligations or professional interactions. For the first time in 33 years, I felt like I was living my actual life instead of performing someone else's version of what my life should look like. You know what's funny? I told Dr. Martinez during one of our sessions. I always thought that accommodating my autism would make my life smaller and more limited. Actually, it's made my life bigger. I have more energy for the things I care about because I'm not wasting it on things that don't work for my brain. Austin became a completely different city to me once I learned how to navigate it as an openly autistic person. The same city that had overwhelmed me with SXSW chaos became a place full of autism-friendly resources, neurodivergent community, and opportunities to thrive as myself rather than survive as someone else. But the most important change was internal. I stopped seeing my autism as something to overcome and started seeing it as something to understand and work with. My autistic traits weren't obstacles to success. They were tools for a different kind of success that was actually sustainable and authentic. I was finally home in my own brain, in my own life, in my own city, and I was ready to help other people find their way home too. It's March 2024 now. I'm 34 years old, sitting in my home office in Austin, looking out at a city that's getting ready for another SXSW. But this year, for the first time in my life, I'm not dreading it. I'm not attending SXSW. That hasn't changed. Large crowds and sensory chaos are still overwhelming for my nervous system. But I'm also not spending 2 weeks hiding in my apartment, ashamed of my inability to enjoy my city's biggest cultural event. Instead, I'm using SXSW Week as an opportunity to work on my latest project, a resource website for late-diagnosed autistic adults. Because it turns out that my story isn't unique. There are thousands of us, successful professionals, parents, partners, community members, who spent decades not understanding why life felt so much harder for us than it seemed for everyone else. The website is called Austin Autism Stories, and it features interviews with local autistic adults about their diagnostic journeys, their masking experiences, and how they've learned to build authentic lives in a neurotypical world. The response has been overwhelming. I thought I was the only 35-year-old software developer in Austin who couldn't handle team happy hours, wrote one person. Reading these stories made me realize I might be autistic too. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Because while my story happened to unfold in Austin, the core experiences, the masking, the burnout, the confusion, the relief of finally understanding yourself, those are universal. Let me tell you what I've learned in the 3 years since my diagnosis, because maybe some of it will resonate with you. First, if you're reading this and thinking, that sounds like me, but I can't be autistic because... Stop right there. Whatever comes after that because is probably based on outdated stereotypes about what autism looks like. I can't be autistic because I'm successful at work. Actually, many autistic people are highly successful in careers that align with their neurological strengths. I can't be autistic because I can make eye contact and have conversations. Autism presents differently in everyone, and many of us learn to mask these traits from an early age. I can't be autistic because I wasn't diagnosed as a child. Autism understanding has evolved dramatically. Many of us, especially women and people assigned female at birth, were missed by earlier diagnostic criteria. I can't be autistic because I have friends and relationships. Autistic people can and do have meaningful social connections. We just might approach them differently. The diagnostic criteria for autism have expanded significantly in recent years as researchers have recognized that autism presents very differently across different people, ages, and genders. The old stereotype of the non-speaking, socially isolated male child represents only a tiny fraction of the autism spectrum. If you're an adult who has always felt different, who struggles with social situations despite seeming normal on the surface, who has intense interests or need for routine, who experiences sensory sensitivities or executive functioning challenges. You might be autistic. And that's not a tragedy or a limitation. It's information that could transform your life. Second, the diagnostic process is worth it, even if it feels scary or expensive or time-consuming. I know that getting an autism evaluation as an adult can feel overwhelming. Many insurance plans don't cover it adequately. The waiting lists for qualified diagnosticians can be months long. The assessment process is intensive and emotionally draining. But having that official confirmation changed everything for me. It gave me language to understand my experiences. It provided a framework for advocating for my needs. It connected me to a community of people with similar neurological wiring. It allowed me to access accommodations and resources that made my life significantly easier. If you can't access formal diagnosis right now, self-identification is valid too. The autistic community largely recognizes self-diagnosis because we understand the barriers to formal assessment. But if formal diagnosis is accessible to you, I'd encourage you to pursue it. Third, masking is exhausting, but unmasking is a process that takes time. You don't have to rip off the mask all at once. You don't have to be authentically autistic in every context immediately. Start small, start safe, start with people who already care about you. Maybe you start by stimming freely when you're alone. Maybe you request one accommodation at work. Maybe you tell one trusted friend about your diagnosis. Maybe you join an online autistic community where you can practice communicating without masking. Every small step toward authenticity makes the next step easier. And anyone who prefers the masked version of you over your authentic self isn't worth the energy it takes to maintain that performance. Fourth, autism is not something that needs to be cured or fixed. This was probably the hardest thing for me to accept. I'd spent 31 years trying to fix, hide, or overcome my autistic traits. Learning to see them as neutral differences rather than character flaws was revolutionary. My need for routine isn't rigidity, it's self-care. My intense interests aren't obsessions, they're passionate dedication. My sensory sensitivities aren't weakness, they're heightened awareness. My direct communication style isn't rudeness, it's honesty and efficiency. Autism brings challenges, absolutely. Sensory overload is real. Social communication differences can create misunderstandings. Executive functioning struggles can make daily tasks difficult. But autism also brings strengths: pattern recognition, attention to detail, systematic thinking, genuine authenticity, deep focus capabilities. The goal isn't to eliminate your autistic traits. The goal is to understand them, work with them, and build a life that accommodates your neurological reality while leveraging your natural strengths. Fifth, community matters more than you might think. I spent most of my life thinking I was better off alone, that social connection was more trouble than it was worth. I was wrong. What I needed wasn't less social connection. I needed different social connection. Finding the autistic community in Austin showed me what authentic relationships could feel like. No masking required. No social scripts necessary. Just honest communication between people who understood each other's neurological reality. If you're newly diagnosed or questioning whether you might be autistic, I encourage you to connect with other autistic adults. Online communities, local support groups, autism organizations in your area. You don't have to figure this out alone. Sixth, your city probably has more autism-friendly resources than you realize. I lived in Austin for 31 years before I discovered the network of autism-friendly businesses, events, and communities that existed here. Museums with sensory-friendly hours, restaurants that accommodate dietary restrictions, social groups for autistic adults, employers who understand neurodiversity. Every major city has these resources, but they're not always well publicized. Libraries often have information about local autism services. Autism organizations maintain lists of autism-friendly businesses. Online communities share recommendations for accommodating venues and service providers. You don't have to force yourself to enjoy neurotypical spaces that exhaust and overwhelm you. There are alternatives, and finding them can transform your relationship with your city and community. Finally, this is not a story about overcoming autism. This is a story about embracing it. I didn't get diagnosed and then work to become less autistic. I got diagnosed and learned to be more authentically autistic. The goal was never to fix myself. It was to understand myself and build a life that worked for my actual brain, rather than the brain I thought I was supposed to have. 3 years later, I'm more successful at work because I can leverage my autistic strengths instead of fighting against them. I'm in a healthier relationship because I can communicate my needs directly instead of expecting my partner to guess. I'm more connected to my community because I found spaces where my natural communication style is valued. I have the same autistic brain I've always had. The difference is that now I'm working with it instead of against it. So here's my call to action for you. If any part of this story resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in the masking, the burnout, the sensory struggles, the social exhaustion, the feeling of being different but not knowing why, please don't ignore that recognition. Start researching, take online autism assessments, connect with autistic communities online, talk to healthcare providers who understand adult autism presentations. Consider formal evaluation if it's accessible to you. Your story matters. Your struggles are valid. Your need for support and understanding is legitimate. And there's a whole community of us who understand exactly what you're going through. You're not broken. You're not too much work. You're not antisocial or difficult or weird in a bad way. You might just be autistic. And that could be the best thing you ever learn about yourself. If this story helped you understand something about yourself or someone you love, please share it. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories from the neurodivergent community. Leave a comment telling us about your own journey, whether you're newly diagnosed, still questioning, or supporting someone in your life who's autistic. The more we share our real stories, the easier it becomes for other people to recognize themselves and seek the support they deserve. Every person who finds their autism community makes that community stronger for everyone. Keep Austin weird, keep yourself authentic, and remember, the right people will love you not despite your autism, but because of the unique perspective and gifts it brings to the world. Austin taught me that weird is wonderful. Autism taught me that different is not deficient. And at 34 years old, I'm finally living like both of those things are true. If you're still searching for your own truth, keep going. It's worth the journey. You're worth the journey. And when you find your people, when you build your authentic life, when you learn to love your autistic brain, save room for one more person in your community. Because there's always someone else who's still figuring it out, still searching, still wondering if they're the only one who feels this way. Spoiler alert, they're not. None of us are. And that's the most beautiful thing about finding your neurological tribe. Realizing you were never as alone as you thought you were. Welcome home.